Good evening to many of you. Good afternoon to some. Good morning to still others. And much thanks to everyone for joining the webinar. It's just the top of the hour now, and I think we'll have a few people joining us as we get started. But in the interest of time, I'm going to begin the webinar now. I am Diana Mackay, and I'm with the Institute for Global Health and Development at Aga Khan University. And my role is to help get us started with a few comments to set the stage for the session. I'd like to remind everybody that we are recording the session, and we will make the recording available on our Institute's website within a week or two. And as we proceed, I will post the address for the Institute's website in the chat so everybody can see how to access that. Second, we have a number of people joining us today, and I'd like to suggest that we use the Zoom webinar features to their fullest. We have enabled the chat function, so I would encourage you all to introduce yourselves by name and organization in the chat. Note that you can send your chats both to the panelists or to all participants. So be sure to click on all participants as you're preparing to introduce yourself and your organization. Otherwise, only the panelists will be able to see your introduction. So again, please send your introductions to all participants. We also have enabled the question and answer function in the webinar today, and we would encourage you to pose questions that our moderator and our speakers might want to address during the course of the conversation that will follow the presentations. And I would encourage you as well to feel free to communicate with any of us by email, and I'll post our email addresses in the chat as the webinar progresses. The webinar is accredited by the Accreditation Council for Continuing Medical Education. And for those of you requesting it, an e-certificate can be provided after the session. To get us started, I would like to introduce Dr. Zulfikar Bhutta. Dr. Bhutta is the founding director of the Aga Khan University's Institute for Global Health and Development, and he is the co-director of the Sick Kids Center for Global Child Health in Toronto. Among his many distinctions during his remarkable career spanning issues of women and child health, nutrition, and other aspects of the health-related sustainable development goals, Dr. Bhutta is a member of the National Academy of Medicine, the highest academic and scientific platform in North America. And he's also been elected a fellow of the Royal Society, the oldest science body in the UK. It's our pleasure to have him serving as our host and moderator today. Dr. Bhutta, over to you.
Thank you very much, Diana, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the fourth webinar in the series initiated by the Institute for Global Health and Development at AKU. I have the great privilege of overseeing some of that process. And I must say that this initiative by the university, which is actually barely a year old, less, was set up precisely for this purpose of focusing on issues, wicked problems that relate to more than health, that are related to multidisciplinary challenges that the world faces. And the four pillars of the Institute for Global Health and Development therefore reflect those issues: climate change and its various manifestations, issues that relate to environment and health, food security, nutrition, and the sustainable development goals broadly, with gender equity, issues of gender equality underpinning this. When we set up the Institute, little did we know at that time that the world would very soon fall into its greatest challenge that we faced for the last year with the pandemic. And if you look at what we have faced during the pandemic, many of those pillars and areas of work of the Institute become relevant. And that's why the four webinars that we have hosted over the last year become even more relevant. We've spoken about climate change, we've had a discussion on agriculture, food security, and we've had a very interesting and important webinar on gender equality and relevance to the geographies that AKU serves. These webinars are not only meant to highlight and introduce these issues to the faculty, students of the Aga Khan University and Aga Khan Development Network, they are specifically targeted to stimulate discussion around areas that are of relevance to low and middle income countries, and particularly the geographies that AKU and Aga Khan Development Network works in. And that's one of the major reasons why the topic of the webinar today becomes even more relevant both in the context of the relationship of water to health, development, to gender issues, and you will hear from our wonderful panel that I will introduce shortly. But I'd like to start by thanking people who are attending today's webinar. I know everyone has probably 50 options in terms of webinars to attend any given week, but we are very grateful to many illustrious people, including the deans and the heads of various entities at AKU, Alcan Development Network, and people outside of the AKU family who have joined. And I see a number of names up there in our participants list. Let me, without further ado, proceed to introduce our provost, who has been the leading spirit behind many of the activities that we've undertaken in the Institute per se, Professor Carl Hammerheim. He joined AKU as the provost and its vice president academic a little over 3 years ago. His academic career has been fantastic, illustrious. He started his career as a grad student in Buffalo, and then he joined the University of Toronto as an assistant professor and rose through the ranks to become the chair of the Department of Geography and the graduate program in planning, and then became the dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences in 1997. Professor Hammerheim then joined the University of Alberta as its provost and vice president, and that's how he initiated at that time a lot of complex and strategic relationships with Aga Khan University. But amongst his many achievements was also initiating a very close collaboration with China, and his work in China has been quite notable because he's not only been a member of the international review team of the Higher Education Evaluation Committee in China, but has also had professorships at the Beijing University and Zhejiang University. He's also had enormous experience with health management, and the government of Alberta engaged Dr. Hammerheim in 2015 to join Alberta Health and shepherded through a very complex process of reorganization. And he served as the Deputy Minister of Health in the government of Alberta. He is an officer cross of the Order of Merit from the Federal Republic of Germany, a rare honor, but I think amongst his many notable accolades has been the receipt of the Eagle Feather to celebrate the contribution to the role of traditional knowledge in the First Nations in the university program 2014. That's a very rare honor. So without further ado, Carl, the floor is yours. We'd be very grateful for your comments and for us to get started. Thank you.
Thank you, Zulfi, and good day, everybody. Assalamu alaikum, Karibuni, welcome. It is an exciting topic for us today, not just because water is the foundation of life, but as you watch the news media from around the world, you can see the immediate effects of extreme weather, all the way south in Texas, where snow, ice, and rapid accumulation and cold temperature is very uncommon. Pakistan represents a fantastic single country laboratory for all aspects of water in climate change, in health, from the far north, the roof of the world, where an overachieving winter season dominates, to the far south on the shores of the Indian Ocean, where such events are rare. So it's a week in which we will talk about the health effects of water, water quantity, water quality, but we can also see in graphic and sometimes really scary detail the effect of extreme weather events and water in its various forms showing up in places where it is really quite unexpected. We have a lot of students with us today, and this seminar, one of a series in Zulfi's Institute, is almost around the world. I think we have a gap in Japan that we have to work on, but otherwise we have people joining this webinar based on institutional identity from around the world. And we have colleagues from new partners in our global quest. You saw a chat from one of our new colleagues at Algoma University, Nairn Cameron has been working on some of these issues for some time. So thanks to Algoma University, which is leading discussions in water with Canada's Indigenous communities. We have many disciplines in our audience today, and the topic of water brings an inherently multidisciplinary and a transdisciplinary approach. These webinars are very important. We have learned a lot about webinars in the last 14 months, along with the rest of the world. While academic discourse remains an intensely people sport, so to speak, we have made tremendous progress, and we have learned that events using technology like the Zoom platforms allows people to come together frequently and with a level of intensity that we had not really experienced pre-pandemic, when we relied on very expensive airline tickets to move people around. So this is really very exciting, and it's a all-in intellectual experience with students, experts, policymakers. Everybody on the Zoom platform is equal in the eyes of Zoom, and it's a very strong step forward, I think, in global academic conversations. Our panelists today are already talking about new projects. There was a short discussion before we went live on an opportunity that one of our panelists is bringing to our attention. We are very excited to see increasing participation from people that we've known for a very long time, but are now coalescing around our institute. Colleagues from MIT, colleagues from the University of Waterloo in Canada. University of Waterloo led the development in Canada of experiential learning, co-op learning, internship learning, and experts from Waterloo in Canada continue to help the Canadian higher education system evolve. And Susan Elliott will bring her expertise to the AKU conversation in new and wonderful ways. Jim Westcoat, many of you know, but they will be introduced more formally later on. So many countries here. We will talk a lot about the extreme challenges facing Pakistan with the condition of the Indus River, but it's a story that can be repeated in many countries as major arterials that provide healthy, safe drinking water have become extraordinarily stressed. The boundary between the US and Canada, or US and Mexico, the debates about water all over the world are important for us. So with that, I hand things back to Zolfi to get us started. Thank you once again for coming, and please let us know if there's any way we can help you remain connected to our institute following this webinar. Thanks and good day.
Thank you, Carl. And let's get going. It's my great privilege to introduce the three speakers to the audience, and I shall try and do this succinctly. And I know I will not be able to do justice to their written bios, which have been shared with all of you. So I'll be brief. Our first speaker today is Professor James Westcoat. Jim Westcoat has been the Aga Khan Professor Emeritus of Landscape Architecture at the Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, known as MIT. And that's around the time, about 10 years ago, when I first got to know of his position. He has also co-directed the Norman Leventhal Center for Advanced Urbanism. Before joining MIT, he has done a wide variety of things at various universities around landscape research, geographic theory, and water resources. But his most notable works are as follows. He led the Smithsonian Institution's project on Garden, City, and Empire, the historical geography of Mughal Lahore. So he knows Pakistan extremely well. And he has led a landmark study funded by US EPA of potential climate change impacts on the Indus River Basin with the Water and Power Development Authority, WAPDA. He published in 2003 a monograph on water and life, water management and environmental policy. And at MIT, Jim has also taught a wide variety of things, including Islamic architecture, environment, and water conservation design. So he is absolutely an authority on some of the areas that we're going to discuss today. Our second speaker is Susan Elliott from the University of Waterloo, and she is also a medical geographer and was initially at the University of Victoria, and then moved on to McMaster's before she moved on to Waterloo. So she's done the rounds at some of the best universities in Canada. At Waterloo, she is currently the professor of geography as well as university research chair, and also an adjunct professor at the United Nations University Institute for Water, Environmental and Health. And she is our first international associate faculty member at the Institute for Global Health and Development. Let me formally welcome you and tell you, Susan, how grateful we are that you've joined hands with us. She has had extensive work on the relationship between environment and public health, broadly defined. And she's also done a fair amount of work on the role of the built environment. The majority of her research is on this bridging of science and policy, which is extremely important in our area. She's also a senior editor of the Social Science and Medicine, a very well-known journal, but importantly, she has just become the editor-in-chief of a new journal on well-being, space, and society. Welcome, Susan. And our final speaker today is our own Professor Stephen Leon from the Institute of Studies of Muslim Civilizations of the Aga Khan University in London. And Steve, again, if you look at his bio, is an anthropologist par excellence. I mean, he was the head of anthropology at Durham from 2002 to 2018, a professor and senior lecturer at various times. And he's been on the executive board of the Society for Anthropological Sciences, and it's president-elect and president. But he has maintained his interest in Pakistan studies because he was a chair of the Pakistan Studies Group, and he has particularly worked on Punjabi culture in Pakistan off and on since the early 80s, including a longitudinal study in a Pakistani village for over 20 years. So he brings in a tremendous amount of contextual knowledge and experience working in this space. So let me turn to Professor Westhorst for his initial talk as he takes us through his own sense of how these relationships hold between water and health. So Jim, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Zulfi and colleagues and friends. It's a real pleasure to be part of this Aga Khan Roundtable on water and global health. And I'd like to focus briefly on some of the linkages between water health and climate change. And I think we need to share screen here if we can. Okay, am I visible?
Yes, we can see it now, thanks.
Terrific, thanks. Okay, I'm going to begin with the initial observation that this water health climate change is a frontier nexus, a kind of an underdeveloped field of study, and then use three examples of what I think are some promising lines of research. The first, we'll look at climate, water, and food modeling in the Indus River Basin in Pakistan. Second will be on some collaborative work with the Aga Khan Agency for Habitat on community and watershed scale planning for hazard mitigation. The third will cut across scales and look at environmental drainage problems, multiple scales and strategies for addressing their health impacts. The Venn diagram indicates these three fields. Each of them is very well developed. The intersections between any two also well developed, but the intersection of all three, I'll show in a moment, warrants a lot more research attention. Just as one example, we see just one variable on the right-hand side that's plotted out. This is by El-Fatih Al-Tahir's research group at MIT, looking at wet bulb temperatures, which are highly correlated with human heat stress threshold values. And we see that they're projected over the course of this century with climate change and warming to extend across much of the Indo-Gangetic plains and one of the most densely populated areas of the world. This just one of scores of hydroclimatic health variables linked with infectious disease pathways, wash behaviors, vector habitats, nutrition impacts, water hazards, just one of many. If we look at a table of bibliographic search results with the title words in leading science, engineering, medical, and multidisciplinary search indexes, the intersection of climate change, water, and health drops off dramatically. Now, this is an exaggeration because these are just a title search, but even with keywords, it would be less well developed than some other research nexi, particularly the water, energy, food nexus. This is a real model. It's developed quite dramatically over the past decade or two, but also the climate change, water, and food nexus, which is starting to develop and is relevant, particularly in the Indus context, as we'll show. Notwithstanding some of these call it limitations in the field, there is a lot to work with. AKU has produced a exciting new white paper on the topic. WHO has a quantitative risk assessment on some of the potential effects of climate change on health, uses some gridded population and data with gridded economic scenarios and climate scenarios to assess the mortality indices of some 6 health priorities: heat stress, diarrheal disease, dengue, malaria, and so on. One complexity, though, arises from the sheer diversity of different water-related health problems. The table on the right-hand side is an expanded classification of these diseases that builds upon David Bradley's pioneering research in drawers of water, a study in East Africa with geographer Gilbert White and sociologist Ann White in 1972. It distinguishes several different infectious disease routes or pathways. And Jamie Bartram and Hunter have expanded this. The 5 categories that they've identified are waterborne diseases, which have historically focused on infectious disease. They've added to that ingestion of toxic chemicals and nutrient minerals. A somewhat new adapted category are water access related diseases. These include the previous category of water wash diseases, skin and eye types of infections, but added to that hydration related illnesses and injuries and effects of even violence on water health. Water-based diseases are those in which pathogens have some of their life cycle in aquatic hosts. The water-related vectors are including the water-biting and breeding vectors that have different water habitat preferences that occur in rural and urban environments. And another new category is this engineered water system related diseases, which includes aerosol-related inhalation and other types of infections and diseases associated with more built and engineered environments. Now, this expansion of the classical approach to water-related disease is a major contribution, but it's important to consider whether it needs to be expanded further. To include, for example, the effects of nutrition deficiencies, hydroclimatic hazards, and settlement drainage types of problems. And I'll give a quick example of each of those additional types of problems now. If we take the Indus River Basin, shown on the left here, it faces the full range of water, climate, and health hazards. It supports the largest contiguously irrigated area of the world and a rapidly growing food insecure population. In such contexts, one needs to add food to this water, climate change, and health. So we have a 4-fold nexus rather than a 3-fold one, in part because agricultural crops and vegetation generally are the largest consumptive use of water worldwide. Secondly, food modeling is already included in many of the Indus Basin models and other river basin models. And that capability enables one in principle to extend the models to start to consider some of the nutrition impacts and health impacts of hydroclimatic change. Now, in preparation for this talk, I contacted several of the major river basin modeling teams for the Indus that are listed here on the right and was involved in 2 of these studies. And in most instances to date, the health impacts of climate change in the Indus are mentioned and discussed qualitatively, but have not been modeled. At the bottom of the list, however, is a promising partial exception where the World Bank and IFPRI in their Pakistan Getting More for Water from Water report used a CGE model and social accounting matrix framework to generate food production and consumption scenarios. It's highly aggregated at the provincial scale, but if disaggregated and coupled with some other health types of databases and systems of the sort that AKU colleagues have worked with, we could start to look at some of these connections between Indus Basin modeling, nutrition, and health. Big problem, however, is the spatial mismatch in the data system. So climate data is occurring in one set of spatial units. The irrigation data is collected by zones, which consist of commands, distributaries, and watercourses. None of them line up with any of the local government data collected for agricultural and food products by districts, health data, water infrastructure, and sanitation types of interventions at the Union Council level. So there's a major challenge here with spatial data integration. Can be addressed, would be exciting to do that, but a necessary condition to make these Nexus connections stronger in the Indus Basin context. Okay, if that's at the large scale, what happens if we scale way down to the community-based types of analysis of these water, climate, and health problems? For that, I'd like to offer an example, a second example that is comes from collaboration with the Aga Khan Agency for Habitat in Tajikistan, where villages faced a full array of waterborne, water-related, and water vector diseases. They also face some significant hydroclimatic uncertainties. A village located downstream at the junction of 2 rivers here will depend upon a glacier upslope here, the variability of which in snow and ice melt scenarios is highly uncertain. It's an ungauged basin. How does one plan for that? That's one fundamental question. But additionally, when we look at this right-hand set of plots, these are all really, excellent data that AKA has collected at the household level, which look at the different exposures to frequencies and magnitudes of different natural hazards. And here they are: avalanche, floods, flash floods, rockfall, bank erosion, debris flow, mudslides, landslides, and underflooding. And these are things that the villagers in particular are extremely worried about. Each of these hazards is triggered in part by changes in moisture conditions and thus by climate change. So how can these complex correlated hazards of very different frequencies, different physical mechanisms be addressed in integrated ways? I think there's exciting work in multi-hazard assessment techniques these days that can help address that question. But additionally, I'd like to emphasize the role of planning and design. And here on the left-hand side, you see a very rigorous community-based planning process that the AKA team has developed to assess the community-based concerns and preferences and start to consider some of the possibilities there. And this highlighted circle here starts to introduce the contributions that designers can make and physical planners can make to this process by starting to help imagine different spatial alternatives, village location and configuration adjustments that can reduce the potential health effects of hydroclimatic hazards of the sort that are then graphically depicted on the right-hand side. Okay, so if this is now at the small village scale of integrated assessment and planning for hydroclimatic and health hazards, how do we start to connect these different scales of assessment of the village up to the larger river basin region? And here's where I'd like to kind of suggest that some of the kind of types of work on environmental drainage might be relevant. We worked with the Aga Khan Agency for Habitat in India on the left-hand side at the village level, which shows a multi-scale drainage design strategy. Drainage is going to be an increasing problem from a health standpoint, as both with increased precipitation, increasing household water supplies are going to be coupled with sewage water management. Soils are kind of declining in infiltration capacities, sewer encroachment, all compounding drainage problems in rural and urban environments. And these increase waterborne, water-based, and water-related vector diseases. On the right-hand side, we start to scale up from the individual village to, this is a assessment of some 1,800 villages in Pune district in Maharashtra, India, and start to assess their water and sanitation conditions and peri-urbanizing regions of that district to help prioritize some of the potential village interventions. We call this at this kind of scaling up from gur, house, gully, lane, gao, which is the village, and then the nala, which is of course where all the bad problems wind up. So as we look at this kind of scaling across regions, it also is going to be possible to kind of start to look at how urban and rural drainage is coupled with agricultural drainage problems, waterlogging, salinity problems in large basins like the Indus, and start to make connections from the very smallest to the very largest scales. Well, these are just three examples, and I'd kind of return to the beginning here with the sense that this really is an exciting yet frontier nexus. There are exciting and important types of research possibilities to consider for the future, and I'll welcome any questions or comments that colleagues may have after my friends complete their presentations in a moment. And that's what I had to share this morning, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you for that great overview. We now turn to our second presenter, and I've already introduced Professor Susan Elliott. Susan, the floor is yours to share your thoughts and views on the topic.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to Jim for setting the stage for me so very well. I'm just in the process of sharing my screen here, and I will make that full size. So many overlaps. I'm just so excited to follow you, Jim. So I want to talk a little bit about water and global health. And my tagline that I often use when I'm writing, when I'm speaking, is 3 through 6 via 5. What this implies, firstly, is the intersectionality of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. What it also implies is the transdisciplinarity of the approach to address the global water crisis, that we need different kinds of sciences and different kinds of scientists to address this problem. We often say that the world has problems, universities have departments, and somehow we need to break down those silos and bring us together. What it also implies is the quintessentially gendered nature of SDG 6, right? The water and sanitation goal with respect to the provision of safe water and adequate sanitation And from a transdisciplinary perspective, that means that health is more than simply the absence of disease, right? And that the gendered nature of WASH is more than the fact that women spend more than 2 million hours every year fetching water. So Jim talked about the Bradley classification of disease, which was great, and the enhancement of that by Jamie Bartram and colleagues. This is the original. And of course, we talk, I know, so I won't spend a lot of time on this because Jim already did, but we talk about waterborne diseases, outbreaks related to water quality. And cholera is a very good example of this. That still exists in many parts of the world where consumption of contaminated water means that, we get sick and sometimes people die. And it's a very unpleasant way to die, but it's also the topic of one of the most romantic books that's ever been written, Love in the Time of Cholera. And it's also the subject of one of the most romantic love scenes ever filmed, according to the IMDb website. And if you're really interested in cholera, I think this is one of the best books ever written about the cholera outbreak in 1858 in inner city London, which was solved by the physician John Snow. And this is written by an investigative journalist. So if you want to learn more about that, it's a great place to go. Water wash diseases are when there's not enough water to wash, literally, and personal hygiene is compromised. And here we talk about skin and eye infections, diarrhea, and so on. But I wanted to focus in on this situation of jiggers, which is a flea that burrows underneath the skin, which doesn't even make the list of neglected tropical diseases. And it has huge impacts on the quality of life. I mean, it's very rare that someone would die from this, but you can see tremendous malformation of hands and feet particularly. And so I have a colleague who works in Kenya with the Kenya Medical Research Institute, who is a partner with a major international shoe manufacturer named Tom Shoes. This organization gives 1/3 of their profits to international grassroots organizations like the one that my colleague runs. And in particular, if you buy a pair of shoes from this organization, they will buy a pair of shoes for a child in a developing country. And so my colleague's organization called Cohesu has distributed over 100,000 pairs of shoes so that children have shoes to wear to try and protect their feet from the fleas that cause jiggers. Because at some point they get so feet get so malformed that the children can't walk anymore. And of course, water-based diseases like leishmaniasis, transmitted through something that lives in the water. And until I started working recently with colleagues in sub-Saharan Africa, I didn't fully appreciate at all the gendered impacts of these kinds of diseases, because when women spend a lot of time standing in the water, doing laundry, bathing children, washing other things like dishes and or themselves, those critters can infiltrate their reproductive organs, and therefore they become infertile. And that has huge implications if you're a woman in those societies, if you can't produce children. And then of course, water-related diseases that bring us dengue, fever, and malaria. So the estimated burden of illness in the world, this is by Cruz-Houston et al. This is the most recent update, 1.6 million deaths per year related to inadequate water, sanitation, and hygiene. But if we translate that into disability adjusted life years, so what is it like living with a disability? Because many of these things, schistosomiasis, jiggers, and so on, they're not things that will kill you, but they certainly impact your quality of life. 105 million daily adjusted life years. Which represents about 4% of the total in 2016. 60% of overall diarrheal burden, 43% of schistosomiasis, 80% of the malaria burden, and so on. So it's a big burden of illness on a global scale. So what is the world doing about the global water crisis? Well, in 2000, of course, we signed on to the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, but at that time, water did not have its own goal. We were subsumed under environmental sustainability, and there were specific targets that we would cut in half the number of people who had inadequate access to improved water supply by 2015, and the same for adequate sanitation, improved sanitation. We met that water target 5 years early, according to the key performance indicators. I'm still a bit dubious about that, but that's because I work in the water area and I'm not telling anyone that they're not doing the right thing. But I still see so many people in that situation. I'm a little dubious about whether we actually met that target. And of course, we came nowhere near to meeting our sanitation target. So then, of course, we have the Sustainable Development Goals from 2015 to 2030, and we get our own goal, right? Clean water and sanitation. So we see the importance of this to the other goals. Last year, 2020, UN Water came together and said, we need to pull our finger out of the dike. We really need to accelerate what we're doing because we are not going to achieve what we set out to achieve. So they set out this global acceleration framework last year to ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all is alarmingly off track, according to UN Water. At the current rate, we will not reach our targets by 2030. At this pace, we are at 1% progress every year, and we need to be at 3%. We need to triple our progress if we're going to achieve that goal. So we're pretty far behind. And of course, in the midst of this, we have a global pandemic. We have a pandemic that in order to stem the spread, we have to be able to wash our hands with soap and water. So a focus of my research is how do you do that when there's no water? How do you do that when there's dirty water and no soap? So what am I doing about it? The focus of my research is really water health and well-being. Sometimes I think it might be water, well-being, and health. Because I'm not sure at this point whether water leads to health and therefore well-being, or water leads to well-being and therefore health. But what it does is unpacks for me the broad nature of what health means, because it could be psychosocial health. We've done work in sub-Saharan Africa on the psychosocial health impacts of not having access to safe water and sanitation, the stigma associated with that, the worry and anxiety. Impacts on well-being. Well-being is its own concept now that we're trying to operationalize and measure. And we're not quite sure how to do that yet. And in fact, as Sophie said, we've just started this new journal on well-being, space, and society because there's not really even any venue to publish work where we're trying to define and operationalize these things. Water is an issue of dignity. The communities that I work with in sub-Saharan Africa are often communities of seniors and communities of young girls. And so without access to safe water and sanitation, that has huge impacts on dignity and therefore well-being. A really strong focus on gender because, as I said at the outset, water is quintessentially a gendered issue. And this leads to a research focus on violence. And that's part of the expanded classification of water diseases that Bertram and colleagues produced, because we know that violence is a huge issue for women in their search for water and safe and adequate sanitation options. We know those things because of the stories that women tell other women. There's very, very little research in this area. We have also done some work on issues around social capital, and Jim pointed to this, where we need communities to come together to work on these problems together, but sometimes there isn't the social capital that we need to be able to do those things. So we've worked in sub-Saharan Africa administering the World Bank Social Capital Assessment Tool, and then attempted to build social capital so that communities could resolve these issues themselves. And the final issue is around empowerment. If this is quintessentially a gendered issue, if this affects women in such a unique an impactful way, then women should be part of the solution. Women should be part of the management team that figures out how to resolve these problems. But women have very little empowerment in the decision-making around water. Two of my young colleagues from Queen's University and from the Stockholm Environment Institute have actually developed a gender empowerment index in the context of WASH, and they've piloted that in Ghana and Burkina Faso and are working to pilot that in other countries as well. It's not just what we do, it's how we do it. So I'm a member of and part of the leadership team for what's called the Canadian Coalition for Global Health Research. And several years ago, the coalition developed these principles for doing global health research, all based on the foundation of equity. This is a recent publication in our journal in Social Science and Medicine that explicates the importance of these principles in the context of global health research. And in fact, our National Granting Council in Canada, the Canadian Institutes for Health Research, have now moved to recommending these principles for any research that involves global health, and are in the process of mandating those principles going forward for every institute in CIHR. And these principles, as I said, are founded on a foundation of equity, but explicate things like shared benefits. So as researchers, when we go in, we want to make sure that we're not just getting papers and graduating graduate students. We also want to make sure that we are doing something for the community, that there's a commitment to the future, that it's not just a one and done, that we work with community over time, that there's responsiveness to the causes of inequities, that we're going upstream, so to speak, that it's authentic partnering, that there's something in it for everyone, and that we include all, and that we go in as humble researchers, which I think for all of us, at least for my teams, is the hardest thing to do, to be humble. So how I'm applying that in the context of 3 through 6 via 5 is a research program on WASH security and gender-based violence. This began about 18 months ago, and of course, then got shut down for COVID-19. That's been both a curse and a blessing for us, because we have been able to use this time to sit back and conceptualize what we mean when we talk about WASH security and gender-based violence. And so we have a paper under review right now in the journal Health and Place, which identifies what are the factors contributing to the experience of WASH and gender-based violence, and also how that impacts on well-being. We've also had the opportunity to spend some time operationalizing what we mean when we say gender-based violence in the context of WASH security. And so we've got a scoping review that's under review again in the journal Health and Place, where we have characterized 4 different types of violence related to WASH security, including physical violence, sexual violence, psychosocial violence, so indignities and threats of violence, but also structural violence in terms of access to resources from a political ecology perspective. Who has access to resources? Who has access to the power to make decisions? And then, of course, we're moving into measuring that. And we've just got ethical approval after many, many, many months to start working in Uganda on this issue. And we are moving into Kenya, Ghana, and Bangladesh. The other issue is, as Zulfi introduced me, I have a strong passion about science policy bridging. So we will do this through a integrated knowledge translation perspective in order to secure knowledge to action. What are we doing that can have impact and import and effect on the communities that we're working with, not just us as researchers. So thank you for listening. I'll turn it over now to Steve Lyons, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Susan. Professor Lyon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me just pull up my screen. And hopefully that is going to behave. I can get at the, there it is. Okay. Well, first, of course, let me add my own thanks to Professor Butta and the Institute for Global Health and Development, and of course, Diana Mackay for bringing us all together. Like Susan, I think it's great to come after Jim and Susan. They've really set this up very, very nicely. My own interests are really primarily in conflict and conflict management rather than water per se, but I suspect that's the way most people probably get into the water question, is they come from something else and they realize this is extraordinarily important. So what I want to talk about today is really very much about the relationship between availability of water, clean irrigation and drinking water, and levels and types of conflict. So in Pakistan, the ethnographic evidence would certainly suggest that land disputes are both more frequent and more violent in areas where water is unreliable and where water is inadequate for irrigation. So I worked primarily over the last 22 years in a village in northern Punjab, which is in a rain-fed area. So there is no reliable surface water throughout the year. There are rivers that come and go after heavy rains, but they disappear. So all of the water for irrigation will either come directly from the rain or from the groundwater. And 30 years ago, there were hardly any tube wells for irrigation. The wells were all for people's drinking water. In the last 30 to 40 years, we started to see more of that kind of tube well irrigation wells. So what we wind up with is clean, reliable drinking water for irrigation that is still inadequate for the purposes. I think it goes without saying that clean and reliable water is crucial for communities. You can't have a village, you can't have a community without that reliable water. And that finally, managing water is a collective job. That when we have fragmented and individualized water management, it results in really quite erratic resource depletion. And this is, of course, what we see in the rain-fed areas of Punjab, is that people are dropping tube wells left, right, and center without control, and there is no overarching management structure, or at least not one that's very effective. And so we wind up with a groundwater table that is sinking rather alarmingly. Now, reliability of water impacts also the type of land usage and ownership. So when I did my study 22 years ago in a village, in a rain-fed village, over the years, I have also worked in other parts of Pakistan, and I have read, of course, the ethnographic accounts of other parts of Punjab, and I've discovered that in areas where you have trustworthy canals, such as the picture here on the right, you get different kinds of land ownership patterns, and you get different types of disputes. So land accumulation and conflict certainly go hand in hand, and they are related to the availability of water and the ease of access of water. So both the availability of water and the ease of access are good predictors of the frequency and scale of conflict on the ground. Now, it goes without saying that managing any natural resource can be tricky, but water is particularly challenged to manage. And I think in rain-fed areas, it is even tougher. So I've got two pictures here. This is from outside the village where I have been doing my work for the last 22 odd years. And you'll see that there are great areas which are really not arable. It would be very difficult to cultivate them, not because the soil might not be suitable, but because there is no way to get water there. And you'll see in the distance of one of these pictures, picture on the left, that they do carve out little patches of land and they cultivate it, but that's at great expense. It's quite a labor-intensive and resource-intensive task. The picture on the right is one of my friends who tried to introduce drip feed irrigation. Now, controlling and protecting that kind of infrastructural investment is not a trivial job. So my friend who has this drip feed irrigation, he has to leave guards on his fields 24 hours a day. So he has had to build little houses next to the fields where he's had the drip feed irrigation to protect those tubes, those hoses from being stolen. His first round of drip feed irrigation all disappeared within 24 hours. If it wasn't guarded round the clock, it would disappear. So there is enormous competition over not only the water itself, but all of the infrastructure for delivering the water. And that makes it a much more conflicting, kind of tense situation. Now, as Zulfikar says, as Professor Butta says, I've been working in the same village for 22 years. I started working in this village really to look at the agriculture and the politics around agriculture. And I very quickly became interested in the way people manage conflict. And early on, I was told that there are only three things that people fight over, and that's women, gold, and land. So in Punjabi, you'd say Zanzar Zameen. The Zanzar Zameen is the source of all conflict. But of course, when you start talking about the land that people conflict over, water is never far from the issue. That water is connected actually to all of these, but particularly land without water is much less valuable. People don't want to fight over it so much. They will still fight over it because all land is potentially worth fighting over. But the land with water is where you put your most ferocious and most intensive battles. So I want to now do a little comparison between a canal irrigated village in South Punjab or Central Punjab and the rain-fed area that I've been working in for the last 22 years. So I did some work with DFID and IMI, International Water Management Institute, some years back. And we did a social network analysis of the land ownership cooperation around land parcels. We compared that from this canal irrigated village with the work that I've been doing in the rain-fed village, where I've also done a kind of social network analysis of conflict management. So this is cooperation around land disputes. That's the primary source that I'm looking for cooperation. Now, if you look at this picture here, the round dots are the land parcels and the little yellow squares are people. So this is I'll show you the next slide. It's slightly easier to see that here it's blue squares are land parcels and red circles are people. So all of these little blue squares, those are land that people cultivate. So this is cultivated land that people have a claim to. and these are legitimate claims. So you see that there are not that many people who make a claim to each parcel of land. Some of these parcels of land only have one legitimate claimant. Now that's telling. It says, A, there's quite a lot of land parcel that is under cultivation that can actually be irrigated. And there are not so many people with legitimate claims for each of those land parcels, which means the land has been distributed, it's been fragmented, it's been broken up, but it doesn't form the sort of core of a dispute over that land. And so if we look at the irrigation partnerships where people actually cooperate, you see lots of little clusters. And of course, there are the canal boards where people have to cooperate at a larger level. But at the level of the village, people conducting kind of informal cooperation to manage their irrigation, you see lots of this. There's lots of evidence of cooperation to facilitate more efficient, better usage of the water, of the canal water. Now, of course, having said that, we mustn't put on our naive rose-tinted spectacles. I was reading in the paper just the other day that this very village where this work was done, there have been several people who've just been busted for water theft. So even where there is good, reliable, clean canal water, there will still be disputes. There will still be some conflicts. But in this village and in the villages of let me give a shout out to one of my former PhD students, Aurangzeb Moghul, who did a study in southern Punjab. One of the things that's striking is there is not so much of the open, violent conflict. So you don't have the kind of armed people going around fighting over their land disputes. There is still dispute, but the violence is at a different scale. So if I contrast that with a rain-fed irrigated village, so this is a village I've worked in for many years, and there are roughly 10 large landowners. You see here, there are all the yellow squares are the people, they are the landowners, and the blue squares, the blue circles are the large land tracts that are cultivated. So you see here that all of these people make claims to pretty much all the land. So the land conflicts are more or less constant. They are a chronic fact of life, that people are disputing over land. Now, greater than 90% of the land, here we've got the same people, but slightly different representation. This represents a little bit over 90% of the arable land in this rain-fed area. And so you see the way I've drawn this network, this sociogram, the land parcels that are closer to the people, so the blue circles that are closer to the yellow squares, are where the claim is stronger, is more legitimate, and there's more frequent kind of relationship to that land. And so you see that some of those land parcels are actually a little bit distant from all of them. That's typically land encroachment from neighboring villages. So the landlords that I work with, they do regularly try their hand at what's called a qabza. They sort of take control of something. If you can take control of it and keep it long enough, then it's yours and you can pass it on to your kids. The problem is that the next generation, someone will try and take it back from them. You can only keep it really as long as you have a legitimate claim and enough force to hang on to it. I'm not going to comment on the picture on the right, but it's simply yet more of that infrastructure for drip feed irrigation, and just a reminder of how difficult it is to work in a rain-fed area if you're a farmer. So now I have a rain-fed conflict partners. You remember I showed you the sociogram before of partnership. So all of the cooperation that's going on in those little clusters in the canal colonies. Well, here are those same 10 large landowners from that village. And you see, these are the kind of cooperative network partnerships they've had in their land disputes. So you see that the ones on the bottom, the Chaudhry 14, A14 or A13 to A16, A17, those are one faction in the village that largely cooperate in their land disputes against the Chaudhry 18, 19, and 20. And you see there are these kind of factional divisions within the village, which I think is characteristic of most Punjabi villages, probably characteristic of most English villages too, if we're honest. But what we see here is that there is an awful lot of cooperation around land disputes, that everyone is involved. And the problem is, or I don't know if this is a problem, but the feature of it is that most of these people, if not all of them, have a legitimate claim to the land. Because one of the things that happens when you have this unreliable water source is that if you're a small farmer, if you don't have enough land to survive a drought, you drop off. You have to give your land, you have to sell your land to the bigger farmers. So the guys who survive with large land tracts, actually, they claim all the land. They are descended from people who used to own it all. And little by little, generation by generation, you get more and more people dropping off They sell their land to somebody else, but the person who is the cousin to the person who's bought it says, well, no, actually that land was always my grandfather's, so you didn't have the right to sell it to him. You had to sell it back to me because that's my land. So you wind up with quite a high level of chronic conflict. Now that chronic conflict is not out of control. I think that's what I've spent the last 22 years studying, is how does this constant rhetoric of violence, particularly over land that has access to water, how does this get managed? How is it that Punjabi peasants are not constantly embroiled in violent conflict and being killed all the time? And the fact is they are not. Punjabi villages are not sort of hotbeds of people killing each other over land. So there is something going on. Now we see this in the ethnographic record across South Asia, that kinship is an important mechanism for managing conflict. So way back in the 1950s, Edmund Leach wrote a classic ethnography about Sri Lanka, in which he looked at the marriage networks and the kinship lineages and how they were used not only to manage conflict, but principally to manage rights to water. That if you married into the right family, you would get irrigation rights. And that was one of the ways of heading off conflict at the start. So my own work has looked at the marriage networks and the lineage networks, particularly for resource management and for conflict diffusion. So how do you control conflict? Well, one of the ways you do it is you marry the conflicting partners together. So whatever conflict they have, it can't turn into a blood feud. It gets controlled within a kind of kinship group. And so what I have seen in this village, neighboring villages, and indeed in other parts of Punjab, is that marriage is used strategically to make sure that the violence doesn't get out of hand. And that marriages also, those marriage networks and lineage networks, are a mechanism for enforcing cooperation over things like water. I'm going to finish with a last story just to suggest how difficult and onerous this thing can be to manage. A very good friend of mine had a field where there was a reliable tube well about 500 meters away on his relative's land. This is a close relative. He hated that close relative. He refused to negotiate any cooperation with his relative on that tube well. Instead, he paid a fortune to run 2 kilometers worth of pipe from his reliable tube well to that field to irrigate his fields. Now, the conflict between those two is making the water management virtually impossible in this rain-fed area. So this is why I say this has got to be a collective job, where the canal colonies actually have this advantage because they have the canal boards, because they have an infrastructure that does not belong to any one person. They must all cooperate, they must all feed in, and if they don't, there is a kind of a state agent that will step in, and Jim will tell us is not as efficient as it should be, but it is more efficient than the rain-fed kind of free-for-all that we find in the Barani northern areas of Punjab. And with that, I will stop and say thank you very much for your time. And like Jim and Susan, I welcome any questions or comments. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you ever so much. And if I could ask our panelists to kindly turn their videos on, and we move, and you've left us just sufficient time as planned for the Q&A. So may I also request the participants to send in your questions through the Q&A option. And if you do send it through chat, make sure that you also paste it in the Q&A so that we can get it. And while we are collating these questions, maybe I can start with all three of you to maybe say something more about the relationship of water and conflict. And we've spoken about, Steve, conflict in the context of local influences. But the biggest challenge from just a global perspective, water in the subcontinent, is the potential ramification of the Indus Basin Treaty or Indus Water Treaty, which is under threat every year, and the potential of really conflict at scale between states. And I'm not just talking about India versus Pakistan. As you can see, Bangladesh has had its fair share of problems also with water supply from India. So what do you think the region, a volatile region, should be doing to ensure that we don't have water blow up into a major security dimension for the region. And I don't want to underplay this because few people know that one of the major genesis of the conflict in Syria was around a water sharing conflict. Darfur was around sharing of underwater resources. So the relationship between water and insecurity in the big sense is quite well established. So maybe let me ask you turn by turn. So maybe start with you, Steve.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think it's an excellent question. And I recall some years back when Pakistan and India were having their momentary flare-ups, which they do on a regular basis, the foreign minister of India said, remember, we've got the source of all the water of the Indus Valley, so we could cut that off at will. And the foreign minister of Pakistan said, but we have a nuclear bomb and we could drop that. And everyone said, calm down, calm down. But it's true. An awful lot of, you sort of wonder, why is Kashmir such a hot issue? Well, Kashmir is many reasons a hot issue, but one of them is, of course, the water runs through this area. So if you control Kashmir, you actually control a large part of the water. And I don't think that people would necessarily, you couldn't get people to go to war over water directly, but it's there. As you say, Zulfikar, in Darfur, water was a major issue. In other areas, you see that water, when people don't have water, it's very easy to get them agitated about other things. And I said some years back, about 11 years ago, when I was getting interested in water in Pakistan, it was because of a report I read in the WHO. And I thought, when people in Pakistan run out of water, if we think the Taliban are bad now, if we think the insurgencies are bad now, wait till they're not fighting over religious zealotry, but they're fighting over water. It'll still be couched in religious zealotry, but it will be a much more dangerous, and maybe it is already more dangerous. I don't know, but I think this is absolutely right. And in Pakistan, India, and Afghanistan, we do need to pay close attention to people need water.
Great, Susan.
Yeah, so I mean, I work at a different scale, and that's what I really like about this set of discussions, is that we work at different scales, but we all recognize that scale is so important. And so at that spatial scale, of course, the governance issues are very important, but at the local level as well, at the individual level, at the family level, those conflicts trickle down. So we already have violence against women in the context of securing safe access to water and adequate sanitation, and those become magnified when water is short, right? And so I think what Stephen is articulating is that as water starts to disappear, we are going to see an escalation of conflict. I think what I'm suggesting is that escalation of conflict will happen at a range of spatial scales, all the way from the individual to the state.
Thank you. Jim?
Yeah, I can build on that, because I think this kind of local, call it fabric of violence that Susan's mentioned, and that Steve is really so thoroughly documented, can sometimes scale up and cascade at higher levels. The good news, though, is that for colleagues who work at the Transboundary Freshwater Dispute Database, in their compilation, have not found documentation for armed conflict in international regions, and the Indus Waters Treaty, for its various limitations, is still regarded by the World Bank as one of its greatest successes in history. It's under a lot of pressure, partly though due to other politics, and I think that's where the politics of water has to be treated explicitly as political science of water, whereas in more engineering realms, it used to be something you try to avoid, try to work around. If you make the politics explicit and treat it just as economics has been mainstreamed, make politics, including social politics, explicit, then we get a better sense of strategies for, as Steve was saying, conflict management, and Susan was saying kind of familial conflict dynamics that are crucial for understanding larger scale problems as well.
Thank you. Well, we have a whole bunch of questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to try and club a few together. So maybe start with you, Jim. There are a whole bunch of questions on salinity in terms of an issue in Pakistan, and also innovations around water conservation. What are the new developments, both in the context of rural populations, but also urban populations like urban slums, that you might want to highlight?
I can't be more excited about this because right now you've got this kind of experiments underway, Punjab, but also elsewhere on it's kind of adapting what are coming out of crop intensification strategies. So it started out with the system of rice intensification, but now going to other crops, and LUMS has some work in this field as well, which is kind of promises to transform all of the production functions for irrigated crops, where if you manage, and I saw one question concerned soil health, if one takes the health of soils seriously, then some of the production will be increasing in yields dramatically with fewer inputs. So imagine right now we tend to model things and we add more inputs to get more outputs. But imagine if you have a situation where you're reducing the water and reducing fertilizer applications, but through improved soil health, gain greater yields. This changes the whole equation for the Indus, and that will be crucially to connect in with salinity, treating salt and salt budgets in the same one that we treat water budgets with the same kind of rigor. The salt management problem, if salinity were not a problem, we would treat the groundwater aquifers as the next great dams. We don't need new dams because the aquifer is the great reservoir. But with salts, you got a different equation.
So Jim, staying on this, are there things from within South Asia or East Africa where one could point out to innovations in slum populations, large urban mega cities, where, you know, water supply availability has become a major issue? Most places have water brought in containers or limited supplies. Are you seeing anything exciting as you do your horizon scan?
You know, definitely. And, you know, you build on the existing successes. So one of the great successes worldwide from self-sewerage of urban areas is the Orangi pilot project. I mean, just nothing like it in Karachi in terms of success. Now, it transports the problem to the major nalas and the streams. And throughout South Asia, there's not, with the exception of maybe the Osho Nala in Pune, a successful Nala restoration project to point to. So anyone who can solve the Nala problem coupled with Orangi pilot project, there's that kind of success. But then there's also kind of very local type of household types of cultivation strategies where you are running food crops up the side of your wall, even in Kacha types of settlement process. So extraordinary innovation. They need to be supported, and the OPP and other programs like it offer some good strategies.
What would be really fascinating would be to be able to see if those innovations can be exported to other parts of the world. I mean, when I think of Kibera, which is the largest slum in East Africa, just outside Nairobi, right? So 1 million people, where water sanitation issues are absolutely paramount, and you have 1 million people packed in together. There are no such innovations happening. So what could we transport? What could we transfer?
Yeah, anecdotally, I'm told that, you know, COVID offered an enormous opportunity because people just could not move for weeks with the same ease as they could do before. And the communities did find ways and means of water security, of getting some water in through systems that were more equitable than they were normally, and required a lot of community organization. So there are perhaps some examples from last year that we need to study in detail. While you're there, Susan, there's a great question from Jonas on the role of religion in the context of water. Now, this is, you know, maybe different in different contexts, but it's related to gender violence, inclusion, exclusions, women in particular. I mean, you know, what happens in the context of their own needs, girls' schools, you know, the whole issue of WASH in relation to girls' schools. So could you say something about what is your view on this in the context of the geography that AKDN works in?
That's a very good question. In fact, I teach a graduate course at the University of Waterloo in the Collaborative Water Program, which involves students from all over campus. And normally we do a session on water and faith. The issue of violence against women, of course, is a cultural one. And that culture is very much influenced by the norms in that particular culture. And a lot of those norms come from religion, of course. And so we find it striking in our society that when we look at like the DHS data, the Demographic and Health and Social Survey data collected from countries in East Africa, where there's a high percentage of people reporting, both men and women reporting acceptance of violence against women under certain circumstances. And so cultural change, of course, is the hardest change in my view. Technology and innovation are absolutely amazing. And we can engineer lots and lots of things, but it's very difficult to engineer cultural change. And so one of the major issues around water and sanitation is just keeping girls in school. When girls reach the age of menstruation, they often stop going. There's no sanitation facility for them at the school to deal with their needs. If girls don't have water at home, they're often bullied or made fun of because there's an odor about them or their clothes are stained. And I will never forget standing in an elementary school in Ghana where the headmaster pointed to a grove of coconut trees and said, that's where the adult men wait for the little girls when they need to go and relieve themselves during the day. If we can keep girls in school, that's one of the first things that we can do to empower them so that they can become the people who make the decisions about their own access to water.
Thank you. Steve, there are a group of questions here, which I think I'm going to pass on to you. One is on the very important role of social constructs, community cohesion around decision-making, whether it's related to water supply and sharing, or it's related to issues like preventing deforestation and some of the underlying determinants of change over time. What does your study or research in this space tell us? Are there some communal, social factors that we could take heart from?
Yes, I think there are. I think it's a really good question, and it's a very interesting thing to think about. One of the things we see across Punjab is around shrines, these local shrines, not the big shrines that are tied to the big Chishti or something, but the little local village shrines. Those sheikh, those pir, those babas, they like trees. And so around every shrine, you see a lot of trees, and people are reluctant to go chop down trees in the vicinity of a shrine because, I mean, in the area that I work, there's one that's on top of a mountain. Babaji is there, and Babaji likes his mountain. He likes his trees. So people leave it alone. And that seems to have power. Now, it also goes hand in hand with enforcement. There are other people who are there beating people who dare to try and cut down a tree, but they have the legitimacy, they have the authority to police this. Whereas in other areas, it's much harder. You know, it would be much harder. Whereas a shrine does provide some of that kind of communal ideology that around a shrine, you have to have a lot of trees. And so that's there. And I think when I did this work with IMI and DFID, we were looking along the Indus Valley Basin for some kind of metrics to say which communities would be amenable to an intervention. And as much as I love my primary village, it would be terrible for this kind of intervention because the kind of cohesion you're talking about, Zulfikar, is really landlord dominated. So each landlord has his own little fiefdom, his own little thing, and they're competing with one another. So the decisions on his land are more or less imposed straight away. But that's at a very sub-level of the village. Whereas some of the others, there was a lot more of that community cohesion because there were no big landlords. They were all smaller landlords. And so you could use things like panchayats more effectively to come to some consensus. Whereas the area I worked in, they did jirga, and it was very much about force. If you had enough power, you could persuade the jirga to decide one thing or the other. Not always, but I think there is room for hope. And you know, to the question that Jonas asked, religion is probably a force in there, but we of course have to be very careful with it because shrines also, as Susan says, they reinforce sometimes other things that we don't want. But around shrines, there is a widespread belief that there should be trees and woods. If you look at you know, Michael Dove's work, Punjabi peasants like trees, right? They always want trees. They want them for shade, their fruit. It's easy. If you give them the trees, if you enable it, then they will actually plant the trees. The problem is that they simply don't have the means. It's not that easy to keep trees going if you don't have the water and if you have a very small plot of land.
Fantastic. And you know, of course, community engagement around this is not just in the context of water, it is also around or prevention of deforestation. It's also around sanitation, and you know, and there's some really exciting opportunities there. I do want to point out that, you know, one of the big challenges around there, even in the most feudal mindsets, is really working with communities to bring about change. And I'm reminded of the Sori tradition in parts of Balochistan, particularly the chalghoza, you know, which is a very special tree with a product, as being one of the things that bridegrooms and others give as part of their gifts or dowries. And that had led to entire chalghoza, you know, plantations being wiped out. And the whole change around that has not been just by legislation, it's also been by community buy-in. There are a whole set of questions, and I'd like to do one final round with the panel. And these questions relate to the issues of water purification and some of the technologies in there and their usefulness, risk balance issues around, and this is specific around chlorination and its acceptability to communities. Let me underscore that by a fact. So we undertook the National Nutrition Survey last year. In 2018, it was released in 2019. And this was the largest survey ever in the entire subcontinent. I mean, the whole sample was 110,000 households with district level specificity. For the first time, I was able to persuade UKAID to allow us to sample water from the same households at the same time as we did nutrition assessment. And the reason for that was very simple, because I could not make any sense out of the so-called stats or metrics of improved water that came out of various other sources. Because by that reckoning, 90% plus of all water in Pakistan was improved. But the definitions include surface water, water in other forms of storage. So the simple question was, how much of this water is safe to drink? So we undertook this survey, and the Water Research Council partnered with us. So not only was this looking at chemical composition of water, but we also undertook microbiological assessment, looking at whether or not it had harmful bacteria, coliform counts. And the bottom line is that over 60 to 70% of the water across the country, more so in certain provinces, was completely unfit for human consumption. So one big question is really the water quality, safety for human consumption. So the question that the audience has asked is, what can you tell us about, again, innovations, new developments on water purification that one might be able to use in this context beyond just water availability? How can we make whatever is available safe for us to drink and in a meaningful, sustainable manner? Let me start with you, Jim.
Oh, gee, this is a tough one. And I guess there's back up from the technological question first. I think there's some fundamental questions. If you ask one fundamental question, for example, is why in a city like Lahore are there no functioning wastewater treatment plants? We get increasing documentation of irrigation-related wastewater contamination of even vegetable products. We got groundwater contamination, Ravi River contamination. And so it's been known for decades that this is a problem. It's been proposed for decades that treatment plants be built, but they haven't. So I think it's a basic question, why not? And maybe it's this combination of, politics and economics, or but I don't have a good understanding of why that hasn't been done. And I'd like to see it explained.
Some decades ago, we had these wastewater treatment plants when the population was more manageable in big cities. I mean, they are largely now dysfunctional or only serve a small population. Susan.
So there's a basic, basic question there, and related to that is that the proposal to finance new wastewater treatment plants in Lahore is contingent upon or to be financed through the proposed large-scale urban development in the floodplain of the Ravi River. And so you say, oh, gee, you know, here's a strategy that's going to put people at risk in the floodplain in order to finance wastewater treatment plants that could be financed through other means, but happen. So explaining that, as well as at the smaller scale, the sources of contamination that go down to the level of the household waste disposal. I think in some ways we have some better knowledge of WASH in the rural context than some of the urbanizing contexts, but I'm afraid I haven't helped you much with this question.
Susan, help us.
Yeah, I would say the same thing, although for me, again, it's an issue of scale, and it's urban, peri-urban versus rural. My sense and my experience is that this is not a technological issue. This is a socioeconomic and political issue. And so we work with the most vulnerable people in sub-Saharan Africa, and those are seniors. These are mostly women who are 90, 95, 100 years old, who are raising the next generation because they've lost all their adult children to HIV/AIDS. So they're jajas, as they're referred to. They raise 5, 6, 7 grandchildren. And this organization that I work with is keen to make sure that everybody has water and sanitation. It costs about $1,500 to ensure that they have a water tank with a purifier and a latrine. It's not a lot of money. But where does that money come from? So the organization tries to fundraise. In the urban context, in major cities in Kampala, it's very easy to bribe somebody to get a wastewater treatment certificate if you're building an office building or an apartment building. There was a situation that I studied there where somebody just kept going to water person after water person until somebody agreed to take the bribe and give them a water treatment certificate for a new apartment building, and they caused a cholera outbreak because what was going down the toilet was coming right back in the taps. So it's not a technological issue. It's a political issue, an economic issue, a social issue. And part of the issue, I think, is still this ongoing debate about, do we privatize water or not privatize water? Because when water companies are privatized, you know, it's the most vulnerable who suffer. Witness the outbreak of COVID-19 in the United States of America, which touts itself as, you know, the best country in the world, where there were 90 cities in that country who had to pass legislation to force privatized water companies to turn water back on to poor households who had been cut off because they couldn't pay their water bill, but they had to wash their hands to stem the spread of COVID-19.
That's a tremendous, tremendous example. And it brings to mind exactly the role of water companies when things go south and wrong. And it's the story of what happened in Flint in particular.
Exactly.
You know, so if the audience don't know what it is, they should read about this in terms of water contamination in Flint.
Yes, and it's a standard public health issue. If you're not safe, I'm not safe, right? I need everyone else to be safe so that I can be safe and healthy.
Steve, final word to you, my friend.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think I will have a better answer for this in a year's time, because I see some of my colleagues on the call. Jeff Tan, Anna Grieser, and Matt Birkinshaw and I are working with Karakoram International University and ACA in Gilgit-Baltistan to look at the WASEP schemes, these water and sanitation schemes, which are community managed water schemes that deliver clean and safe water. We're looking at the drinking water, but there's also a sanitation side. And we're trying to figure out, can this be scaled to urban areas? The jury's still out. We haven't finalized it, but you know, I think there are many things we can learn from this about how we could apply. And ultimately, I think Jim is right. Lahore and Karachi have got to be cracked. If we don't get Lahore and Karachi safe drinking water, then actually we're in severe trouble across the country, because that is where so many people live. And that's where so much of the economic activity in the country happens. So it is vital we figure it out. And I think studying these rural areas that have worked, figuring out what can be scaled up to bring the communities in, because Susan is 100% right. This is a sociological problem, socioeconomic problem. This is about management. The technical side, I think we can fix, but the social side, we still need to work on. Thank you.
Yeah, but we also need a good idea of what the social approaches and solutions are. So I will take Jamila's last question as part of my concluding remarks to say that we may not have had hundreds of people on this webinar, but we have had some very engaged people and some probing questions. So I want to thank all the audience. I want to thank in particular our panel for taking us through this extremely interesting and vital project. And it is an extremely important issue, both in the context of public health development, but as you've heard Sue Elliott say, it's a vital part of gender studies in the subcontinent, because the people who face the problem in terms of both water availability, bringing it miles for consumption are the women. The girls who suffer because they have to drop out of school because there is no running water or no safe toilet are the girls. And this therefore has implications in terms of social development, in terms of human development, which go way beyond the narrow scope of water for health or water for well-being. There are also things that the Institute for Global Health and Development can do. As many of you know, we are a very active knowledge synthesis and translation group. And we have groups that work on various things like both systematic and scoping reviews and also evaluations across continents. So we have teams working in North America, in Pakistan, Central Asia, and also now in East Africa. So I think what this field, just given the scale and scope of the questions, could benefit from is a lot more in-depth probing on some of the knowledge and innovations that are emerging from the discipline that people may not have ready access to. A couple of years ago, my team did a global review of water sanitation hygiene interventions, but a very narrow point of use purification or bedside or household level purification, not at the level or the scale that Jim was talking about. I mean, what is the evidence out there that you could do things at scale, at population levels, in metropolitan populations that would make a difference? So that's something that we may take on as an institute itself. And we would definitely keep you all, our wonderful panelists and collaborators in the loop, and also to people in the audience who've been listening. If these are areas of interest of yours, by all means, get in touch with us, because that's precisely what the institutional platform does from the AKU perspective. The Institute for Global Health and Development was set up principally to promote scholarship in this space. So I want to close by, again, thanking everybody for participating and pointing out that we will be meeting again soon. On the 9th of March, we hope to have a webinar on COVID-19 and Sustainable Development Goals. What are the implications? And we'll have a keynote as none other than Professor Jeffrey Sachs from the Sustainable Development Solutions Network and Columbia University as our keynote speaker, and a group of panelists that would be very important contributors to this space from both the public and private sector. So I would like to invite you to that. Watch out for further information in this regard. And if you have any questions or any feedback, kindly let Diana Mackay and I know. And we thank you once again for your participation today. All the best. Diana, any final words?
That's it. Thank you very much, everybody. Great to have your participation. Join us on our website. There's a vehicle there for you to sign up to receive communications from us. So thanks, Steve, Jim, Susan. Thank you, Zulfi. Bye-bye.
Pleasure.